In the wake of the farmers' protest yesterday and Rachel Reeves' inheritance tax hike, the vociferous backlash among farmers, Nigel Farage and Jacob Rees-Mogg have emerged as staunch defenders of the agricultural community's interests. Farage has seized the momentum following this mass demonstration in Whitehall, which had and he advised farmers to strategically shift their focus from national protest to targeted local actions. His rationale, of course, is Labour is now holding between 70 to 100 rural or semi-rural constituencies, and they are vulnerable, of course, in areas won by narrow margins. Undoubtedly, he sees reform as picking up the slack, and he posits that a visible discontent in these market towns could precipitate a re-evaluation of the so-called tractor tax, potentially nudging the government towards a policy revision or a recognition that it will lose the next election. I think because there are so many rural seats that in the present Labour government, and because the farmers have such a long memory, I think the chances of there being a protest at the next general election now are very high, and they will struggle to hold on to those rural seats. I think Farage is simply suggesting that this message is driven home sooner rather than later. And the Reform UK leader's approach is not without historical precedent. He draws parallels to the countryside's reaction to the hunting ban, a battle he felt was lost because of metropolitan indifference. And this time he exudes confidence in a potential reversal, portraying the farmer's plight as one that could tip the scales because of its broad-based support in England's rural heartlands. I think in this he's probably right. And the difference between this and the much larger protest about the hunting ban, which came at the beginning of Tony Blair's time, is the protest in London for the tractor tax has been relatively minor. Only about 20,000 people turned up, in contrast to the much bigger protest about the hunting ban. But the hunting ban was something which could be accommodated in the local communities, and this strikes at the livelihood, the genuine livelihood of farmers and their inability to plan. If, for example, you are a farmer and you're relying on the inheritance tax system remaining unchanged, and suddenly it's changed, and you don't necessarily think you are going to live for another 7 years, you can't suddenly hand your farm over to your children in the belief that that inheritance tax will not then be due. That is the problem. If you have 7 years to implement this change, fine, I see no problem with it. Similarly with the VAT on private schools, if you have, I would say, 4 years to implement a serious change to education, allowing for children to pass through GCSE or A-level, or to pass from one school to another, it's about a 4-year cycle. 3-year is pushing it a little bit. That would just about be possible. But one term is vengeful and spiteful. And similarly, a matter of months to implement this tractor tax, again, is vengeful and spiteful. And I'm not surprised that there is concern. Now, in both cases, the government is taking a calculated bet that the farming community is relatively small and the community of children who are being sent to the smaller private schools because their parents can't afford to move to a catchment area that encompasses that boasts better state education. This is this assumption, I think, is fundamentally wrong, because it's an assumption that is predicated on nastiness, on spite, and ideologically driven propaganda. If we want to see what that is, all we have to do is look to the east, to Mr. Putin, and we can see very easily how propaganda is wheeled out. It's spiteful. And I think in the end, the farmer's tax, the tractor tax, is one stage too far. Enter Sir Jacob Rees Mogg, this Tory traditionalist known for his ornate rhetoric and nostalgic conservatism, who's framed this tax as a cultural affront. Rees Mogg's words, dripping with indignation, accuse Labour of being a government of vandals intent on severing Britain from its agrarian roots, and he invokes the post-war resolve to maintain domestic self-sufficiency and land ownership within generational farming families. Of course, the problem is that the government that he was part of, that Jacob Rees Mogg was part of, had done so much damage to farming families, particularly under George Eustace, implementing EU reforms. For Jacob Rees Mogg, this tax is more than a fiscal policy. It's an existential threat to a way of life revered for centuries. Not only that, I think he should have said that it's a threat to our country, because our country is predicated on, depends on farming. Farming has defined the way our country looks, and we change that at our peril. The government's counter-arguments, represented by the Treasury Minister James Murray, have not helped to mollify the situation at all. Murray's advice to find out how inheritance tax works has been considered, is thought to be condescending. Many farmers believe that it's patronising. They argue that such financial planning advice ignores the realities of generational land stewardship and the sudden burden that changes impose. And there was a fellow yesterday, a fellow called Murphy, Professor Murphy, who did a piece where he very slowly explained why the inheritance tax rise was actually to the benefit of farmers. It's sort of chop logic. And I responded to that. But he started his talk off by saying that he had done some accounting for farmers when he was much younger, 40 years ago, and he found them. Well, let's paraphrase. He found them annoying, always complaining. So his talk was based on the fact that he didn't really like farmers. So how could he then turn round and offer advice that is supposed to benefit farmers? He doesn't really like them. and you can't ignore that preamble, even if you think what he says seems reasonable. And the problem with this sort of cod science of economics, I have many friends, people in my own family who are economists and who love statistics and maths, but one has to recognize that economics is really a cod science. And although it's very interesting to look at it, I find it fascinating to look at it with hindsight. This thing of using economics as a tool of fortune telling, prognostication, it isn't accurate. This is the problem, because we're dealing with real life. It's a little bit like politics as a subject. These two subjects, economics and politics, I find them both fascinating. I'm not convinced that we should rely on either as academic disciplines. These are practical tools which are extremely insecure. Yes, we should study them, but we should look backwards, not forwards. And I think simply because somebody offers an argument doesn't mean it's necessarily right. It needs to be challenged. And an argument is not only about the nitty-gritty of the actual twists of the logic. It's also about the emotional investment. You need to look behind the words. And that, I'm afraid, is what I was doing yesterday, and I will continue to do it. As for James Murray, his reliance on technicalities such as nil rate bans, spousal transfers, and gifting rules may resonate in theory, but they fail to address the emotional and economic disruption foreseen by affected families, and they presume that you have time. You have time to make adjustments. That time is not available for many farmers. And for those who are facing the end of their working life or the end of their life, this is a burden which has suddenly been imposed by a short-sighted and aggressive government. And it's mean and thoughtless. Farage's strategy isn't really going to help them a lot, because again, it's all about the future. But his strategy is clever. By concentrating protests in Labour's precarious constituencies, he aims to harness the pressure of local discontent to sway political calculations. And he's absolutely right about that. This tactic underscores the fluidity of rural support. Once a Tory bastion, now eyed by Reform UK, of course, as fertile ground for influence because of the disillusion. And Rees Mogg's declaration of a tax as an assault on prosperity and freedom evokes not just economic but philosophical dimensions, appealing to those who view such measures as symptomatic of a government detached from rural England. This episode in British politics illustrates a broader struggle, a tug-of-war between metropolitan policy decision-making and countryside resistance, punctuated by figures like Farage and Rees Mogg, who are adept at galvanising populist support. Whether this campaign succeeds in compelling Labour to rethink its position hinges on whether the government perceives farmers and the farming movement as a substantial threat to its electoral strongholds, and it should, or simply an echo of past grievances. If the government is calculating that this is their fox hunting moment, I think the government has got it wrong. This is not about class warfare, and Starmer is right in saying that. This is about class destruction and the country's destruction. Now, I have no problem with class destruction. I have a big problem with the country's destruction. And destroying something does not automatically mean you are saving something else. If I destroy the farmers, I don't automatically save the countryside. If I destroy the private schools, I don't automatically save the state schools. And that is the fundamental problem. We can go back in history a little bit to, for example, Martin Luther. By destroying the Catholic Church, by setting up the Reformation, Martin Luther did not restore integrity to the Catholic Church. The Counter-Reformation didn't necessarily do that. All he did was to split the system. The same thing was true with the Great Schism. Some people incidentally think that the word is schism or schism. All three are acceptable pronunciations, just before anybody makes another comment, because I've had those comments in the past. I say schism. Schism. I say schism. I say schism. The great schism. And schismatics don't necessarily build bridges. Destruction doesn't necessarily mean building. And this is the fundamental problem with Rachel Reeves' approach, with Keir Starmer's approach, with Brexit. I mean, before people start saying, oh, you're on one team or the other, my focus is against both of the main political parties. The party that enabled Brexit, the party that had already piled on so much destruction to farms through George Eustace, and other incremental things. Farming has suffered a great deal over the years, over the last 14 years, and this is one burden too many. This is the stick that breaks the camel's back. It's too much. And schools similarly. Schools are struggling. It doesn't matter whether they're state schools or private schools. What is needed is not an attack on one part of the school system, but a rebuilding of the entire school system. What is needed is not an attack on the way farms hand on their tools to the next generation, but on finding the workforces and the systems to make farming more efficacious. This isn't going to make farming better. This is going to make farming more of a struggle. It might make people in Westminster feel that they're getting a little bit of extra money trickling in. But they would have more money if they made the farms more profitable. They would have more money if they made schooling more effective, more functional. We need to get rid of a lot of the problems that we've got in our society, and the same thing is true of the NHS. The NHS needs to be stripped of a lot of its unnecessary bureaucracy. And until that happens, the NHS will not survive. It doesn't matter how many extra doctors and nurses you draft in. It doesn't matter how many extra teachers you encourage to start training. You're not going to improve the schools, you're not going to improve the NHS without some drastic changes in the way these institutions work. And we see in Turkey today how when there is chaos, the evil and the crooked find ways of exploiting that. There is chaos, and serious chaos, running through almost every part of British society.